All right, welcome everybody. So good to see all of you here joining with us today for this special webinar, The Future of Family Ministry. My name is Kenny Connolly, and I'm here with my other co-host, Nick Blevins. We're the guys behind Ministry Boost. We love to come alongside and help partner with family ministries and recruit volunteers and all those sorts of things. And we're really excited about this today because we're going to be having a great conversation with Reggie Joiner and Leslie Mack. But let's do some introductions first. Nick, why don't you introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll introduce our esteemed guest.
Our esteemed guest. Yes, I'm Nick Blevins, Next Gen Pastor at Community Christian Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Work with Kenny at Ministry Boost. That's about it. That's about all I have for you. Got 3 kids, 10, 7, and 4. They're all not here right now. The house is quiet. The dog is actually not here right now. It's a very rare time in my household, and I'm loving it. I'm enjoying it. And I get to talk to our esteemed guest. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. And if you're just joining us, we have chat enabled on here. I know Nick is working on making sure the chat's working on the page, but there's a lot of people already chatting. So if you haven't already, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, what you do, and we'd love to see who you are. We got a couple tickets to Orange Conference that we're giving away. We're super excited about. So make sure you're active in the chat. Ask some questions. We'll have an opportunity to ask our guests some questions in a little bit, and we'd love to see you at Orange Conference. I know Nick went to the very first Orange Conference back in when was it?
1950.
1950. Reggie, you look really good for whatever that age would be then. You led it when you were 2 years old.
I'm still trying. I'm processing the word esteemed still. I think there's one of us esteemed. I'm not sure we both are, but we'll keep going. So
sure.
Anyway,
yeah, that may be true.
Put it in your bio. I think it was 2007, wasn't it, Reggie? First Orange Conference. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. I was a year late. I made it to 2008 and haven't missed a year since. And so we love Orange Conference, and it's definitely my favorite week of the year. Of getting together with, it's like a reunion of all of family ministry friends, and feels like family. And so we're gonna have a conversation today, but let's do a quick introduction. I think most everybody knows Reggie Joiner. He's been such a powerful influence in the world of ministry, personally in my life as well. But and we have Leslie Mack, and so I will let Leslie introduce herself first. All right, so Leslie. I know you work at Orange. You oversee the student ministry curriculum strategy, or even more than that. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you do at Orange?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation today. My name is Leslie. I get to work for this incredible human being, Reggie Joiner, all of his brilliance. It's a super fun thing. But I get to lead our high school department, just thinking about the strategy and the faith in the future of the next generation when it comes to high schoolers. So.
Well, I need to say something about Leslie before we get started. I mean, Leslie is this multi-talented individual. She's one of the most creative people I think I have ever known. She's an artist. She's a musician. She's a writer. She's a producer. And she actually has these amazing insights for Gen Z as she connects and actually works with kids on the front lines. And I just love every time she's in a creative room. We learn so much from her. And we were brainstorming a while ago, what would it look like if we actually had a Mac conference, because her last name is Mac. We will have, serve McDonald's. We'll have free MacBooks. And I mean, there's just a lot of things we could do. We built a conference around. Yeah, I think it would be fun.
It'd be epic.
I think it would be great.
Sure.
Hey, one quick note. I think the chat will work now if you refresh the page. But if not, you can click on if you're watching on YouTube and not on Facebook or something like that, you can click on the YouTube icon there. But I think if you just refresh the page, the chat will finally work, which is great because we want you to interact, ask questions, tell us, your role, your church, where you're from. Some people are watching on Facebook, some are watching on YouTube, some are watching right on the page here. But Kenny, I think we're all good to go.
Good. And Reggie, and I know everybody knows Reggie, and I know a lot of people are on this webinar because we know and love Reggie well, but Reggie, you're even, maybe some people don't know too, like you've had this amazing ministry as in ministry, youth ministry, family ministry with North Point, and then starting Orange, and even now you're in a place of like a shift and change as you've been empowering other people for the future. Why don't you tell us a little bit about like where you're at, and what you're doing at Orange and in life, and even the work that you've been doing in Georgia, and just tell us a little bit more about what's going on in your life.
Well, I mean, I think my entire life has been pretty much involved on the front lines with kids and teenagers. When I was in my actually college years, I was a student pastor. I look back at the church that hired me as a student pastor, and I thought, man, they were taking a risk and a gamble, because there was so much I look back at now and think I thought I knew, but I didn't know. And so I think my journey has really been working in these spaces. I've never done anything else but this, and I've surrounded myself by people that just are really smarter than I am. And I even tell leaders my age right now all the time, you need mentors, but you don't need mentors that are older than you. You need mentors that are younger than you. And when I look around our staff, I think I get energized from not simply, the creativity and the genius that I'm surrounded, but actually the imagination that they have for the future. Because I do think that the future of the church, the future of family ministry, the future of where we're going will be defined by so many leaders that are coming along behind us. And we've got to listen and we've got to learn. And we actually have to take I think the change or the credit that we've earned and leverage it so they can make the changes they need to make.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. And you know what? It's true. As a end user, I've seen that. And one of the most, maybe one of the most valuable resources that you guys created probably about a decade ago was the Lead Small book, and how that's impacted a couple of churches I've led. But I remember how the years leading up to that, of how you brought in small group leaders, and you brought in leaders from all across the country, of like to really learn from others about what was working. And you guys do that really well. Like you guys aren't just a curriculum publisher or publisher books. Like, you guys really do learn from what's actually happening in the front lines in ministry and churches, and you bring people in to hear from them, so that way you can serve the church better. And so I know I've really appreciated that over the years as a next gen pastor, as a kids pastor. And so that's great. We're so glad to have you here. And today we're going to be talking about the future of family ministry, which I love this conversation because having grown up in family ministry, I came to faith when I was 5 or 6 years old in a really great kids ministry in South Georgia, and then having been in ministry for 20 something years, feeling like, I remember Reggie and you and I met when I was just starting and as a next gen pastor, as a family ministry pastor. And that was in a season where I feel like that role was very new. There weren't a lot of us there. And so much has changed in the last 10 years, of where now that's a very prominent role. A lot of churches have that, but even a lot's changed in the last 10 years. And I think in a lot of ways you innovated that role at North Point, when nobody was really doing that. But I've seen a lot of change in the last 10 years about who's in the role, how long people are in that role, and how churches are adapting there. And we're gonna think more about what's going on. So let's maybe start with our first question today for both of you guys too, is, what are some of the things that have changed in the last 20 years? When you think about family ministry and how the church has engaged parents and kids, teenagers, what have been some of the big landmark changes that you've seen?
I think I'll let Leslie kick it off, since she was in elementary school 20 years ago. I think that would make sense, probably.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
probably.
yeah,
Yeah.
as you think through the last 20 years, I'm not even going to go there. What would you say has changed?
Well, I honestly believe so many things have changed. Like, I have a long list in my journal here. Like, we could spend an hour talking about every single thing on the list, but I'll rattle off a couple. And if there are any you want to stop on and we can expound on.
That's great.
Okay, cool. So one of the things that has changed, the landscape of the world has changed. I know that we look at the statistic specifically in the year 2045. That will be the year where the minority kind of shifts, that white will be the minority race in general, which is very curious to say, like, how does that inform what we're doing, the programming we're making? How does this influence and inform the conversation about diversity, about community, about the cast that you present on stage? So yeah, that's one of the things.
Yeah, and I love the fact that when we talk about how important it is for us to lean into diversity, we're actually getting a glimpse, soon, of what heaven's going to be like. Because I think sometimes we forget that there are people that have different experiences, different backgrounds. I love the fact that even in the context of diversity, we can talk about generational diversity. We can talk about racial diversity. We can talk about denominational diversity. And I think that there's a generation watching us right now in a way they never have, to see, how are you guys going to get along? You say that you have Jesus as the center. You say you have this Christianity, but I want to see how that affects your relationships when you disagree or when you have differences. And so I think in relationship to this, there's a world watching how we navigate this space of diversity in the next decade. And they're going to decide what they think about the church, what they think about God, based on how we model.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe another thing that has changed over time is I'm very, very fascinated by this idea of micro generations, or just even like just micro trends, how things are happening at smaller increments and how that influences what we create, how we talk about things. I think one of the implications that has on ministry in general is that all of a sudden it becomes even more imperative that we contextualize to the people in front of us, because they are having a unique experience for who they are, for where they are, for the time period they're in. And I think technology does this really well, and we understand it when there are generations of an iPhone, even though it's an iPhone. I wonder if ministry can learn from micro generations and how you communicate authentically.
That's really good. So. I think we know in the work that we do in curriculums and the work that you do, that there's so much, I think, prioritization related to contextualization. That, you know, we have this statement that we've always said, if content is king, context is queen on a chessboard. So at the end of the day, if we don't help the context happen in the right way, I don't know, truth falls flat. The things that we're trying to teach, they're not heard. And part of the challenge, I think, on the teams that we have right now is to understand in all of these different spaces how we can craft something, create something so that it can be repurposed and contextualized in all those areas.
Yeah, for sure. I think a large part of the contextualization conversation has to do with spending time with the end user, essentially. And sometimes I think we take for granted these assumptions about the end user, whether it's like, oh, these are the kids who show up every week to my ministry, or whatever that assumption might be. But spending more time with them, speaking their language more authentically, meeting them where they're at, I think that's so important.
Now, you can see already why when she enters into a room, when we're having a creative meeting or a strategy meeting, all the wheels start turning and everybody starts going, oh yeah, I haven't thought about that. Because I think the thing that I love about these kind of conversations is, I forget who it was that said one time that the future church is not going to be changed by those of us who have already done things. It's going to be changed by those who are coming along in the next generation and what we look at. And so these are very important conversations to have related to the future of the church.
Yeah.
Maybe
I'd love to ask another question, just like even to drill down a little bit more. Can you spend a little bit more time kind of unpacking what a micro generation is? Because I think for most
Do you want me to do that? I can do that. I can explain to you what a micro generation is. You want me to?
I know,
but I'll let Leslie do it. I'll let Leslie. I'll let her go ahead and do that.
I'm a Gen Xer, and the first time I really heard about what, like, you know, millennials is like probably the first 10 years of ministry. I don't know that I ever like even had a concept of, you know, the generations, and now it seems to become one of the most dominant conversations that we're having. So unpack a little bit more about what you mean by micro generations.
Yeah, for sure. So our team, when we're creating content, we talk a lot about, or we investigate a lot about who is the end user, and we try to figure out what is a common experience that they would have shared. And the more we have that conversation, the more we realize, like, oh, this older Gen Z is so very different than younger Gen Z, right? Or there's probably 3 different chapters of Gen Z that we even had working on our team at one point, where we had there's one girl on our team who's maybe 25, 26, one who's 22. We're having conversations with someone who's 18. And so we want to lump them into Gen Z. But ultimately, when you start asking questions about how does this word land for you, and they start telling stories about things they've experienced, whether it's concerts they've been to, or like, not to bring up the trauma, but the Astro World whole debacle that was experienced different for different generations. And so their outlook on how you talk about gathering in large spaces changes based on their perception of that one event. And that happened in subcategories of whether you're old enough to attend something like that, whether you're old enough to have social media to see the fallout of something like that, whether you're too young to even be aware that it happened. And so there's all these kind of micro experiences. I think in the past, we talked about generations as, oh, they could rally around one big thing, right? Where were you when 9/11 happened? Where were you when Michael Jackson died? Like whatever those different things were kind of bigger mile markers. Now, I think we're experiencing so many sub mile markers. And it's just interesting to know how that affects how you interact with that generation.
To kind of summarize that, Kenny, all you Gen Xers are the same. Gen Zs are unique in all of their spaces.
No.
I'm not. No, but there really is. I think there's a principle here. Oh my goodness. I wish if I could say anything to leaders right now, it would be, you have to be a learner in these spaces. If you're not a learner in these spaces, you're going to misstep accidentally and think that someone is listening, because I used to say it this way. Again, I'm going to date myself, because when I think about the musicians I listened to in the 70s, who are all amazing because they're the reason that all the music that exists. When I think about those musicians, I think about the fact that if I were to take any one of my Gen Z friends and sit them down in the car and play for them, I don't know, Eagles or Chicago, or, they would be going, yeah, that's okay. But I would think in my mind, no, you're not really hearing it. I would turn up so you could hear the brass section of Chicago, so they would hear it even louder. And I think somehow by turning it up louder, they're going to feel differently about it. But what I don't realize is I'm actually playing a song for them that they don't resonate with. And somewhere in our responsibility of handling truth, we have to be good stewards enough to learn who the audiences are, so that we can make sure they're hearing the things that are timeless. And there's a principle there that we just can't ever abandon. And I would say to every leader, you have to surround yourself by the people who are in the audience you're trying to speak to. But anyway,
totally.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about.
I have a question. I have a question where I want to dig in a little bit, because I know this is a debate that happens. Reggie, this will probably be, I don't know, the 100th time you've heard this question. When we talk about things that don't change, which I know we'll get to that in a little bit, some people feel threatened, right? There's this idea that the Bible, the Word of God, is not changing, but culture's changing, and context, king and queen. Like, how do you marry those two together? I think Orange does that really well, which is one reason why I think sometimes you take criticism from two very different sides, because they kind of, one side wants you way over here, one side wants you way over there, and you try to balance those really well, the balance of grace and truth and context and what's not changing. So how do you do that? How do church leaders do that in family ministry?
Yeah, and I would say as a church leader, there are kind of two big buckets you got to think about as it relates to what's timeless. One would be your theological baselines, what you feel like will never change. I mean, Jesus died, he was buried, he rose again. There's a core gospel story and message that is true. It's not going to change. So there are truths, theological, we call them rocks, that we've kind of identified 9 that we feel like even in the 80 different denominations we work with, everybody comes back to these issues. So they're not going to change. There's another thing that I think is timeless that's very important for your culture and your team and your staff, and that would be your values. Like, a value for Orange that we think will always be a timeless value for every church everywhere is that if you don't somehow engage with the family and engage with a parent and get the parent involved with what you're doing with their son or daughter or the kid or teenager, you will be limited in your influence. There's something to be said for the fact that we have to be intentional about partnering with families on the front lines. We learned that during the pandemic, when no one came to church and they all stayed at home. So that's a principle that's a timeless value principle. So 2 buckets, one bucket would be, truth or theology. One bucket would be values. And here's the great thing about that. If you are aligned on your values, then you can have great debates about the things that are temporary and the things that change, which are normally the how-tos. How are we going to partner with a family? How are we going to make sure someone understands the work of the Holy Spirit? What does that look like? And how are we going to communicate that to a kid or a teenager so that they can grasp the mindset of that? So again, timeless versus temporary. When you're aligned in what is timeless, you can fight and debate and collaborate around what is temporary. We get those two things confused. I've seen churches actually think that what was temporary was timeless, and the entire church would split over two camps. And you want to lean in and go, no, you don't understand. You're fighting about something that needs to change, that will change. And one of the best things you can ever do as a leader when you sit down with your volunteer teams or with your pastors or with your staff is when there's a debate and things get heated, bring everybody back to the value, to go, okay, just remember, we're all after the same thing. Here's the value. This never changes. Now let's keep debating. Because when you debate around concepts that are timeless, but you're aligned in your heart and mission and vision and values, the debate doesn't cost you anything. So as a matter of fact, it costs you not to debate. If that makes sense.
That's good.
So that was my timeless temporary values theology talk.
It's like That's you've great. Said it before. That was so good. I threw it at you like a curveball, and you helped out there. That's great. And you mentioned
the reason I say that is because every once in a while a student pastor, a kid pastor will come to me and say, how can I get my senior pastor to get this? I'm like, get what? And sometimes what they want the senior pastor to get is a method that they want to do or a how-to they want to do. And I say, well, first of all, you've got to make sure that he understands or she understands your value. And this is such an important part of your relationship with your leadership, even if you're leading up, because I have never met a lead pastor yet, not one, who has said, no, we don't want to partner with a family. Or no, we don't really care that your message is relevant to the kids who show up. Or no, we don't believe in relationships. I mean, they do believe in those things. You just got to remind them that's the goal. So then you can have the healthy, robust kinds of collaborations and debates.
Yeah, for sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think there's another piece of it too. I think there are the things that are maybe temporary that we argue and debate about, but what if we were able to reframe that to, when we can identify something as temporary, why can't we have more fun around it, right? Why can't we let go of some of it in order to embrace experimentation, embrace kind of, I mean, I think like if I were a youth pastor right now, I would beg my senior leader to help me. Let's talk about, what is timeless, what is temporary, and to let me divide my budget so that I can say this much of our budget goes to the things that are timeless, that aren't going to change, right? This is my legacy money. These are the long game money. But please, can I please have some money just to play over here? And I can let that be my relevance money. Like, I just want to be relevant. So if they're doing this thing in studios and they're, I want to start a podcast for 6 weeks or whatever that is, can, on the things that are temporary, that are just going to be here for a little while, let's experiment, let's learn, let's have a good time doing it and not necessarily have to argue or fight about it.
That's really good. There's a secret I'll tell you about Leslie. When we did the interview process with her, one of the questions she asked was, so I just need to know, if I come work for Orange, will I be told, no, we don't do that way around here? And so, it was because you could tell that in her bones, there really is this, I want to try things and dream things. And you said something that I want to just zero in on for just a second. Why is it that we feel threatened by what is timeless? Why can't we have more fun around what is timeless? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. But why can't we have more fun around what is temporary? Mm-hmm. And that's because people like me have our identities wrapped up in what we created. So don't mess with our identity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but what would it look like if we let that go? What if we decide the faith of a generation is really more important than what we have created in a temporary sense?
Yeah.
But yeah.
For sure.
That's good. And isn't I feel like where I am now, some of the best leaders are the ones who give up what they want or what they prefer or what they would pick for what might be better. Not even what's necessarily better, because sometimes you got to give it up to let the temporary be tried, find out.
Sure. It's experimentation. Yep.
Yes. And we don't have quite enough of that. A lot of times great leaders, even you hang on to it like you're saying, Reggie, but obviously you've been giving up some things, I'm sure. Some things are different, even at Orange. Thanks. I would imagine. They're laughing.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm right. You want to talk about the next question?
Oh yeah.
You all mentioned partnering with parents, and that is one of the kind of that timeless thing. How do you think partnering with parents is changing?
Well, I mean, I think partnering with parents has always been something that we have to work at, that we can't be lazy about. even going into the pandemic, we were wrestling with what does it look like? What does it mean? We've been talking about this for 20 years. And I think the bottom line principle really has to do with something we've always said, that no one has more potential to influence the heart of a child than the parent. And the second part of the principle that almost sounds like it contradicts that is, but a parent is not the only influence a child needs. We absolutely believe, and that's why we call orange orange, because you have the yellow light of the church and the heart or the red of the family working together. I think what the pandemic did was the pandemic just exposed something that was already happening in a brighter way. I think there were a lot of families that were slowly disengaging from churches or from other orgs in a sense that there was a kind of a little bit of a trust crisis creeping in. And then when the pandemic hit and everybody went home for a year and a half, I think it made us or caused us to reinforce or reimagine rather what it will look like to re-engage those families and parents in new ways. The principles have always been the same. I think the question is, how are we going to measure success in engaging families and parents in the future? I don't believe we should have ever been measuring success with how many parents participate or show up in our programs to our church. I think there are other yardsticks, and a lot of them have to do with what we're doing in communities and what we're doing in schools and how we're creating safe places for families with other families to engage around some of these concepts, and how are we handing better tools to families in their home context to reinforce what we're saying every week on Sunday, and how do we cooperate with that? So I think the yardsticks are shifting and changing. I think we're going to have to expand not only how we measure success, but how we see every parent. Mm-hmm. I do think that there's a little bit of a, I would say, a traditional mindset that sees two biological parents with their own biological children as, you know, the end user or the person that we're trying to help or support. And 75% of families in our country are not represented by a husband and a wife who actually have their own biological children. And so it's, you know, when you get to single families, when you get to blended families, when you get to foster care, I mean, there's the grandparents. I mean, there are all these caregivers now in these situations with kids. And we have to redefine what the win looks like for the family, which is another piece. I think traditionally we've measured the win for the family to come to our church, so they're going to help us win as a church. So when they help us win as a church in our programs, then guess what? They're winning, but not really. We've got to start asking the question, what really helps them win? I know Kristen Ivy, our president, pushed really hard last year to release a research project that is just absolutely amazing about, you know, the idea of what parents aren't telling us. And I think we have to lean into culture and to the church to find out from parents in both of these spaces, what does it look like for you to win, so that we can know how to serve and help. So I think we've got to take a different posture as we approach this next decade.
Yeah. And I think one really tiny, go for it.
No, I was going to say, I think that's so good, because I think having been a kids pastor, next gen pastor for 20 years, oftentimes you see the default is family ministry. How do we minister to parents? And then we see single parents, foster parents as add-ons of like, well, we should probably do something for these people too. And it does come about just changing our mind of reframing what the family actually looks like and start from there. And I think that's really helpful. So I think it really starts with us. Of like, when we think of family and ministry, we see through a different lens than we've seen before. Leslie, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say one tiny, really practical way that that's lived out through some of the curriculums we write. And it was a huge lens shift for me. It was one tiny thing that we started to change everywhere. Is that anywhere we wrote the word parent, if it didn't need an S at the end, we just took the S off. And I think sometimes you forget that sometimes that's the default. We always say, ask your parents, or when you talk to your parents, and it's like, just say parent.
That's really good.
And they can choose, you know, and it's tiny, but it's so practical. And that's one of the ways we say, no, we're talking about all parents, all of them. So
that's good. So instead of saying engage parents, we should say engage the parent.
Could be.
You just changed one of our
No,
core
not you mean
values.
all the
right
parents.
here in front of the world.
No.
You changed one of our core
There's times when the S is
values. No, that's
appropriate.
really good.
There's
I mean,
times when it's not.
I'm
There's
thinking
times
about it
when
right
it's
now. I
not.
think it's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
I do think that, let's just be honest, there's a trust crisis.
Mm.
There's a trust crisis with families all over our country. And we have to re-earn and rebuild trust with a generation of families and parents for this next generation. And we have to start there. We can't expect a parent to engage with us if they don't trust us. And the flip side of that is they're not going to trust us if they don't think we trust them. And they hear our statements, they listen to our podcasts, they watch our posts. And I'm amazed at sometimes how many church leaders, without realizing it, will make statements that almost, I think, seem anti-family or anti-parents. And if I'm a parent reading that, I'm going, well, I'm not sure if I show up at your church, I'm going to be welcome or you're going to like me. So I think there really is an important process and posture we've got to reposition our heart in, to go, okay, how can we actually understand what parents or a parent is going through? And then how can we lean into that and start serving in the right way? So,
Well, Reggie, I feel like, though, for those that have been in ministry for a long time, like this may be a reckoning in our hearts. Because I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think there was a position within the church of where those of us in, at least in kids ministry and youth ministry as well, that we felt like, well, if parents would just do what they're supposed to do, we wouldn't have to, like, it's this attitude that we're having to step in and do this. And I know Orange was a big voice in this, 15 years ago, about changing that. It doesn't matter what we do if we don't engage parents, then it may be all for naught. And so, but I think for those of us that are older, we've been around, like, it may be like reconciling with God and with our heart, of that.
yeah.
Our attitude needs to change, that we have to start first with serving parents and meeting where they are, as opposed to parents, if you'll just do what you're supposed to do, this wouldn't be so hard.
That's really good, Kenny. If I were leaning into church leaders sitting at a table, I would say the fundamental question that has to shift is not how is your church being a hero to your community and families, but how is your church helping parents be the hero to their kids? Yeah. And of course, someone's going to spiritualize this and say, well, isn't Jesus the hero? But I mean, I just want to go, okay, at the end of the day, parents will know and they'll realize if you're turning the hearts of the kids to them and their hearts to their kids. And that is a biblical principle. And so I think we have to be very intentional about leaning into the family and helping bridge and build a relationship that by default is going to be the ultimate relationship in that kid's life for the rest of their life. And so anyway, I think you're right. We have to, maybe that's a revival that older leaders need to have, specifically how they see the family.
Yeah.
I wonder about the community part too. That's always been a big thing. Reggie Orange has talked about that, getting parents connected to other parents. And I always feel like one of the biggest benefits is if you talk with enough parents who are being vulnerable, then everybody realizes we're not as bad as we think, because you just realize, oh, you're struggling with that too. And your kid, okay, great. I thought I was the only one, especially when I scrolled Instagram or whatever. But I wonder I feel like churches, I've heard a few that are trying to be more intentional about creating community among parents. In fact, somebody asked Kenny and I recently, hey, it is now my job at my church to oversee not all groups for adults, but groups for parents, to connect parents together in groups. And they're actually making that like a separate part of that person's job description. And they wanted to know who we could connect them to that also does that. And as we asked and posted in Facebook groups and talked to friends, it was like crickets. There weren't that many. I actually just met a church a couple weeks ago that have that. And so I'm going to try to connect those two leaders. But what are your thoughts about that, of getting parents in community together? How do you see churches doing that intentionally? Should we do that more? I know it plays against kind of the normal, or quote unquote, like the common way of doing groups, which is kind of free for all, get groups together however you want. What do you think the church could do there to connect parents better?
Well, I definitely think it should be a priority. And I think Leslie can speak to this in a second about why community matters, relationships, and how that's shifting even as we redefine how we enter into intentional proximity with each other, coming out of what we've experienced the last few years. Which also means we've got to get out of the mindset of what happens in this building is really how we measure success. I think it is so important to do two things. One is to put a focus group of parents around you as a church leader that represent, I don't know, different points of view, different backgrounds in parenting, so that you can begin to develop an every parent mindset in your church. Before you jump into the relationships with parents in your community, I think it would be important for you to have a core group of parents who actually do have a vision of how they interact with parents who have diverse ideas, who in this culture that is so polarized, how are we going to enter into those relationships with respect and with dignity and actually love each other at a table where we may see the world in different ways. So I think it's important as a leader to surround yourself with parents specifically that don't look like you. And if you don't go there, then you're just creating an echo chamber of parents everywhere. They're just spending time with other parents and they're not really learning, I think, some of the deeper things on how to see the world and even how to see God. The second thing I would say is, yeah, I mean, I think anything organic has to be organized to some degree. Organic is, I think, one of the new things that we've got to continue to figure out how to lean into to allow relationships to happen. But every creature, every organic thing has an element of organization. So it's figuring out what part of that you can organize and what part of that you just need to let thrive and grow. But to give it enough intentionality so that you are setting some of your parents free to build relationships with other parents for the purpose of, again, this is huge, of serving them and creating a support group. One of the things the research that Kristen Ivy did said is that parents really, really are looking for support networks where they can be with other parents and have conversations in safe places. Because, you know, if we were really honest here and the public world wasn't watching, we'd be talking about our kids and we'd be talking about things we're struggling with and wrestling with and things that we learned along the way, things that we didn't do right. And we'd be asking questions. What did you do when? But we need a safe place to do that. And I think that is such an important principle in how you begin to put these relationships with parents together. But they can't be safe if you don't have the right parents in your ministry that are leading into those spaces that are safe people. So, yeah. You want to add to that?
Not really, but I can.
Go.
I don't know. Well, I guess I think about there's kind of these 3 A's that we've been thinking through the lenses of agency, advocacy, and adventure, and how those align with identity, purpose, and belonging, that kind of all people, like I think about it through the lens for high schoolers and Gen Z in general, but it really matters for parents and for volunteers as well. Like as people are looking to fulfill one agency, like who am I, what am I doing, am I empowered to do the things that I'm wired to do, all of that. Or when we think about advocacy, a question of belonging, where's my safe space, where can I be mirrored back the goodness that is in all of us. An adventure, like I want to feel all the way alive in God and in my pursuit of Jesus. As we're looking for safe spaces to do those 3 things, I think it becomes so important that we are able to free ourselves from assuming that can only happen in our buildings, because the more I think the safer something is, the I don't know the best way to put it, but essentially the footprint of our buildings can be broadened to provide even more safe spaces to work out those 3 things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, she has a great message. She talks about making sure that you're thinking not only about your square footage and who's in your building, but your footprint you want to have in your community. That's really, really good. And the reason that she used 3 A's is because her dad was a pastor. But anyway, I think that that's something important to know about Leslie. She grew up in a church. For all of those of your pastors watching this, there's hope for your kids. Anyway, so yeah.
Do you want to go on to the next question?
Yeah, let's.
This is a big one. I know a lot of church leaders are thinking about. How do we recruit volunteers? What do we think is changing with recruiting volunteers? And all I hear over and over again, and I think I know we've seen it in our church too, is it's even harder now. If it was hard before, it's even harder now. In fact, there was just a report that came out recently that showed that, the average church volunteerism, if you just measure like as a percent of people serving, is at the lowest that it's been ever measured in this report, and that report's been going for probably 5 or 10 years. And so I wasn't surprised to hear that. So how do you think recruiting volunteers is changing?
Well, you just said it's harder. I think if we were to back up and talk about how's ministry changing, period. I mean, there's a 30 percentile, I think, from everything I read, of pastors and people in ministry, directors in ministry, who have dropped out of ministry. I think that in and of itself has a domino effect or a ripple effect into, if people who are leading ministries are walking away from ministries, how much more complicated is it to get people to volunteer for ministry? I think, again, there's some timeless principles. One of those principles has to do with your relationship with your volunteers. I think there were a lot of volunteers during the pandemic when the lights got turned off and they were no longer valuable in their week-to-week ministry to the church, that disappeared. And when we interview volunteers during that season and time, they admitted, we were important to the church, we were important to our pastor, we were important to the director until they didn't need us. And they forgot that we were going through the pandemic too. We were being hit and we were being hurt and we were having the same mental exhaustion and the same, type of issues that everyone else was having. I think in that moment in time, for those churches who had a great relationship with those volunteers and maintained those relationships, they probably saw a different kind of return. Because when the lights were turned back on, I mean, they were still in a relationship with those volunteers. So there's a fundamental principle related to volunteerism that I think is important here before I get to the second thing that I would say about volunteerism, which is you should be, as a leader or as a minister, more focused on this issue than actually doing ministry on the front lines with kids and teenagers. Because it's your relationship with your volunteers that ultimately will determine the health of your entire ministry and the health of your entire church. I would even go as far to say that if we don't zero in on what it looks like to actually rebuild the bridge to volunteers and relationships, then ultimately it will affect the entire dynamic of churches that are shrinking and aging. Because I believe, and this is why we've given our life to Orange for all these decades, that the leaders who are on the front lines working with kids and teenagers will determine the health of your entire church and the growth of your entire church. And I could give you a list of what I think that changes about the church. The second thing I think is huge is, as you develop that relationship with your volunteers, I think you've got to ask yourself the question, what is my volunteer going to benefit? What are they going to gain? How are they going to grow? What are the benefits that they will receive serving in ministry with me? And we have to think about not just the fact that they're helping us win in a program that they're showing up to do with us. We got to remember they have relationships, they have jobs, they have pets, they have lives outside of our ministry. So how are we helping them win in all those other areas? Because if we're not helping them win in all those other areas, I don't think we're really investing in them in a way that will make sense and cause them to want to be involved in our ministry. And the third thing I would say, and gosh, this goes back to an old principle that I think is true, will always be true, that they have to understand at some point the very simplistic idea that their faith, their personal faith, their spiritual growth is more connected to how they serve, how they invest in other people, than it is in what they learn. Now, if that is true, then as pastors and ministers and directors, we have to practice serving them in a way that we can demonstrate to them what it looks like to serve the next generation. And that's a posture set. I mean, that's another reset for posture that's important. So again, you can add something to that too. I know you've got a lot there.
No, I guess I think about my own time volunteering. Sometimes I think the word volunteer, there's this assumption made that if you are not married, you should be volunteering a lot more than literally anyone else. And if you are married, you're kind of off the hook unless it's something, like, I don't know. So I think it goes to kind of to your second point that it has to feel holistic, because it almost says like, hey, you're not a whole person, so to complete the rest of yourself because you're not married, you need to spend more time at the church. And so I think there is a posture of like, you can hear who they're really talking to when they say volunteer. You can, and there's a heart posture even for me. I'll talk about myself of like, yes, I am single, and yes, I do want to work out my faith through how I volunteer at church. And so I have to separate, even if their motives are wrong, I have to make sure my heart posture is right in showing up to volunteer. So yeah, I think it's complex to be holistic in how we recruit and train and value and see and speak to, like, all the different ways we engage with volunteers. Yeah.
That's really great. I think when I think about coming back from the pandemic, people they can do church from home easier than ever before, and so people are oftentimes opting out. And I think that since the pandemic too, that it's caused us who lead in the front lines of ministry in kids and youth or whatever, that we have to, like Reggie, you were talking about, like, what is it that we're providing for them? Not, and I would say even not just in the care that we give them, but actually giving them a ministry opportunity that really is transformative for them as well. And so, because I know that probably the first 10 years of my ministry, I needed volunteers, but I don't know that I was always strategic about what I was asking volunteers to do. And I think the volunteers want to do something meaningful. I really do. I think most people, when you invite them, they really want to do something meaningful. And if we don't actually give them something meaningful to do, then they're not going to. We're going to always have the challenge of not having enough volunteers, even more so now than before then. And so, inviting people to be weekly volunteers, leading a small group over the course of multiple years, that's a really big ask, but it's actually really meaningful and transformative for both the next generation and for me as a volunteer. And I think that has to be even more so than it was before.
There's another elephant on the table that I think we should talk about related to this, that I think the church has to wrestle with, and they have to do a better job of positioning and explaining. And it's what I call is intentional proximity. I know that I have several leaders that are friends of mine that are in the education system in public schools. And when the schools had to shut down in so many rural counties in Georgia, one of the school administrators came to me and said, if there's one thing that we've learned and that our entire community has learned, it's that proximity with teachers really makes a difference. That being in the room physically with other peers really makes a difference. There are social skills, there are exchanges, there is this, relationship that takes place that does something to the brain that nothing else really actually resolves the same way. And I don't know that we as churches have a good explanation when parents say, or families say, well, it's just easier staying at home, to actually explain why relationships, physical proximity, intentional proximity really does matter, and why God has designed us to be in a room together. Now, what Leslie's explaining is really important, because the room may not be at the church. The room may not be in the building. We've got to reimagine the footprint. And Leslie can spend time talking about what it looks like to engage digitally, because that's an important part of this too. And you've got to make sure that going forward, you're using all the tools and all the platforms and everything you need to use to just increase, I think, the potential of the relationship. But there is no substitute for intentional physical proximity. And the church has to have a better answer than, well, God told us to gather together. I mean, there just has to be a better answer than that. And we need to lean in and go, here are the advantages and the benefits, and why being in a room together really changes the dynamic of a relationship when you create safe places. So I would challenge anyone to sit down and start evaluating, what is it we say? What is it we use to explain why our ministry strategy is connected to the idea of community relationships?
Totally. And I think I'll speak for millennials and some Gen Z.
Not for Gen X's?
I don't know much about
Okay.
that. I just think I believe that
And somebody's got to
honestly,
speak for boomers at some point, but
you
keep
got
going.
it.
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
So
Right. Okay. Great.
I think that the thing we're seeing is that so many of us experience our faith through several different outlets. I think maybe that's another way things have changed. In the past, it was you go to church and you have a Bible, you know, and that was kind of, you know, what the way. But I think now it's like, if you ask me about my own spiritual journey and where I am, part of that is attending church in person, yes, and volunteering and serving. And part of that is this podcast that I listen to that's not just a podcast to me. It's a part of my walk. And part of that is dinners with my friends who don't attend any of the other places I attend, but that's part of my spiritual faith. And so I think as we look at the holistic picture of how a generation is going to engage with God through all of these different ways, as they desire something holistic so that none of the pieces of the pie contradict each other, even if some of them stand in tension with each other, ultimately, I know when I am physically in the same space as someone, it has a purpose more than what I could get from a podcast.
That's really good.
Or when I'm listening to this podcast, the reason I'm listening to it is to carry that to a conversation. And so I think the church being able to articulate when we gather, we are being so much more clear about why we gather. And I think that even ties to some of the mental health part of the conversation, the proximity and the relationships, and just becoming less hyper self-aware when you're in a room with other people. Like, there's so many reasons. And so as we explain, hey, we gather because, be able to fill in that blank with the reason that this is different than your podcast, or this is different than dinner with your friends. So yeah.
It's great. I mean,
that's amazing. I love it. This conversation has been really great. It's been really helpful. And I love having these conversations. And this is actually one of the reasons why I love Orange Conference so much. The content is always amazing, but it's also about being around thousands of other people who are doing what we're doing on the front lines. And those conversations that we have around a dinner table at a restaurant, or standing around, you know, at the end of a breakout, are always so valuable, talking about these life-changing, ministry-altering conversations. And so that's we're really excited about. And we want everybody to come to Orange because it's just a giant party that we get to have every year at the end of April, early May.
It really is.
And we're going to give out a couple of tickets here. So here's what we talked a little bit about generations here today in this webinar, and had fun with that. And so if you're on the chat, I want you to put down the year you began vocational ministry, or maybe you started serving. Maybe some of you are volunteers and you started serving in ministry. We're going to have a little fun. We're going to give away a ticket to the person who has been serving the longest in vocational ministry, and somebody who's been serving the most recent. You know, maybe you came on staff just a couple months ago or whatever. Just post your year in there. But Reggie and Leslie, while we have just a couple more minutes before we wrap this up, can you tell us a little bit about what we can anticipate at Orange this year? And you know, this with a theme this year of is see you tomorrow, right? Is that the theme for this year? Can you tell us a little bit more about what the conversation is going to be, and wrapped into the theme and all those things?
Well, one of the things that makes Orange Conference unique is when we started this in 2007, when Nick showed up for the first time, and then 2008 when Kenny showed up. We really had a vision to say to churches, it's so easy to silo. It's so easy for kids pastors to go to that corner, and for student pastors or youth pastors to go to that corner, and lead pastors, executive pastors to have their own gathering and conference. And we think those are important. We never want to ever discourage anyone from participating in other conferences and other spaces, but we wanted to put everyone in the same room. We wanted to create a gathering for the team, or for individuals who feel like they're alone in their ministry, trying to lead in the spaces that they need some support in leading. So we created this for those in kids ministry and those in student ministry to come together in spaces and meet other leaders and other people who are doing the same things that they're doing, because we think the strategy is more than an age group, but it's actually taking a kid from, you know, birth all the way into college in a way where it's an integrated strategy. So we love to have everyone in the room, because something happens when we look across the aisle of the table and we see other people who are leading kids before us or after us, and what that looks like. The See You Tomorrow theme is actually something that started a couple of years ago. We were kind of coming right out of the pandemic, and I think the church was having an identity crisis. We have a lot of leaders who are mentally exhausted. We think mental health has become a very, very important big issue. And I don't know, there was something about saying to a leader on a conversation in a Zoom call, hey, we'll see you tomorrow, or to your kid or to someone you care about, see you tomorrow, that seemed to make a promise. And we love all of the passages in scripture that talk about, God's mercy is new every morning. And I mean, there's so much imagery around the idea of a new day. And you put all that into the mix with the promise that Jesus made that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and that the church really isn't a building, it is people, and it's not going away. Part of the reason I believe in God is because I look back, at the history I've lived, and I look at the resilience of the church and the people of God, from decade to decade, and carrying the light that they're called to carry. And so I think we need to make a promise to each other as churches. 80 different denominations are showing up. We need to make a promise to stay engaged in the conversations, to keep doing this, to keep working. When people are tired and discouraged, we need to lean into each other and say, hey, you know what? We'll see you tomorrow. We're not going anywhere. We're going to be here. And so it's a promise. It's a promise God made to us. And I think it's a promise that we can make to each other. And in that promise, there's the idea of keeping faith alive, keeping hope alive, keeping love alive, and what that looks like. And we have some amazing breakouts or workshops. We're doing some workshops on a lot of different issues, but at the end of it all, we're trying to create a version of the church that will have resilience into the next decade. And what does it look like for us to stay at this? I know you've said in a lot of the meetings on See You Tomorrow. You want to add anything to the See You Tomorrow while I borrow your notebook with your notes to see what else you've written here for just a second?
No, I think you said it all. One of the things about our theme that has me really excited and super hopeful for the future is that part of that promise is that we don't have to figure it all out 100% right now today, but that if you agree to show up tomorrow and I agree to show up tomorrow, we can keep having the conversation about the things that we're working through. And so I definitely think part of the layers that, hey, let's keep going, whatever it is, let's keep working it out.
She's nervous because I'm flipping through her little notebook here, but I need to tell you a story that's so important. I mean, no, this is so amazing. You can't see this, but the first time we met Leslie, she was at a lab we were doing, and her handwriting and her artistic ability are so great. We noticed at this table of leaders what she had done and how she had drawn charts and pieces of things about what we had said. And now when we're in a creative meeting, no one will actually write a creative card to go on the board, because if she's already put one on the board, we just can't compare. So it's like, but again, there is this strategy in her mind that we just love to watch and love for her to illustrate. And we just thank you guys for letting us be a part of this. And we can't wait to see it orange.
That's awesome.
Kenny, before we talk about giving that away, if I'm right, Leslie, you're leading a workshop on the future of youth ministry. And there's one about kids. And all that. So like, if this conversation is intriguing to you, as you register for Orange Conference, make sure you pick those breakouts depending on where you lead.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
amazing. I will promise you, if you sit in an experience and a workshop with Leslie, you will walk out going, I never thought about that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Thanks, Reggie.
Well, we looked in the chat. Thank you for everyone participating. We have 2 people that we're going to give tickets to. One of them is Debbie. She started ministry in 1983, back when Reggie was starting ministry, probably as well, right? As probably in that.
You sure that's not my wife? Because my wife's named Debbie. Are you sure she didn't get that ticket?
Is a different Debbie? Is it?
I think she already has access to Orange Conference.
Yeah,
I mean, we got married in 1983, so I'm thinking, okay, she did kind of start ministry, discipling me then. So yeah, okay, good.
And then we also have Michelle Breon, and she started ministry in 2023, so brand new. So we're going to give you guys tickets, and we hope to see you at Orange Conference. And man, Reggie, Leslie, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for the conversation. We look forward to continuing this conversation in Atlanta in April.
Can't wait.
Yep.
Love it.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, we'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.